Hello everyone, welcome to School of Port live session. My name is Harry Symington and I am very excited to be conducting this evening's session with Francisca van Zeller. Francisca is the PR and Communications Manager at Aveleda and is a part of a family that has been producing wines in the Douro since 1620. She's also the founder of Provas in Casa, a really exciting wine education project that we'll be touching on this evening. As most of you know, School of Port is a platform set up by Symington Family Estates that aims to educate both wine professionals and wine lovers about port. Today, we'll be talking to Francisca about her career and some of her most recent projects. This session will last around 15 to 20 minutes. Please feel free to share any comments that you might have, and we will try to keep up to date and answer them at the end of the session. So let's ask Francisca to join us now.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thank you so much for joining.
Good to see you.
How has the Vindima been wrapping up?
The Vindima is wrapped up. So
Now,
we in the Douro 100%. The last, because we have other regions in Aveleda, and then the other regions in Baixada was the last one to finish just a few days ago. But it's done. It was a complicated one.
it was a complicated one, particularly given the hot and dry weather.
Yes, and the lack of people, right? I don't know if you've had that problem, but I'm not surprised that in the blazing heat of the Douro, it's not exactly the most attractive place to be harvesting. But I am surprised by it's an increasing problem that we have as the next generation of port to find people to do that job.
It's challenging work. The picking is not easy, particularly when the weather is like it was this harvest. It's very, very challenging.
Yeah. Were you there? You were in the Douro.
I went up for a few sessions. So I went up over the last few weeks. So catching up with the winemakers, seeing how the wines were performing. And definitely the feedback was that it's been a challenging year. We've produced some good quality wine, but in small quantities.
Yeah, but great for port. But also challenging for port, but great for port.
Good for port because of the concentration. Yeah. So low yields, concentrated wines. So it will be interesting to see what the overall scope is of the wines.
Yeah.
So let's get into the session. So we've got a few questions for you. The first one is on your career and how you started in the wine industry. So you come from a wine making family, but you actually initially started your career in a few other areas. How did that help you with your transition into wine?
You know, since I've been growing up, and I'm sure you have a very similar upbringing in the sense that we were brought up in the Douro, and probably the vindimage and the harvest is, for me, it was one of my happiest memories. Still today, I still feel a huge rush when that time of year comes up. It brings around a lot of people. It's a lot of teamwork. It's it's finally you're picking the fruit, and there's a different vibe. And I think since I've been young, that's really been a highlight of my childhood memories, especially the foot crushing and all the aromas in port have really marked some of my happiest memories. And the people I've met in the business, or because of the business, or because of our family relations, has also marked my character and my life. So for me, going into wine was inevitable, in the sense that since I was young, I was always doing little blending experimentations with my father, participating in the harvest. And I was 10 when I first said I want to become a wine cook, because for me that was like baking cakes. You know, you have to put a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then out comes something different. And my father said, well, an enólogo, in Portuguese. It was a word I couldn't even pronounce. And when I was around 16 and finding my way to what I was going to do in the future, one of the other things my father said, wine's always going to be here. If you want to learn the technical part of wine, you have that, for you, if you like. So why don't you go see the world, look at the world through a different perspective? And I loved history. That was my favorite subject. So I studied history at school, at university in England. And that was an incredible experience and actually very helpful for marketing, I find, because it gives you a very analytical brain, but it also puts the focus on the other, and marketing is the focus on the other. It's not the focus on yourself. And observing before acting or taking action. And therefore history for me gave me those mindset skills. So it's not exactly the practical or the knowledge that I gained about the history that I studied, but rather the skills that I acquired, I think were very important. And one of the skills that I most developed was the part of communication and writing and speaking. And, in the wine trade, it's very important to communicate, because the consumer looks at the bottle and has to make a decision based on whether there's a label that they recognize, or it's a packaging that they really enjoy, or there's the ratings, for example, or the price. But then there has to be another layer before the consumer buys the bottle, which is the story. And every time we have the opportunity to tell our story, it's really important. And I think we are a privileged generation because we have online, which is an incredible, the digital platforms are incredible to explore storytelling and how we transmit the image of what we produce. And so anyway, with history, I explored a bit of that part. And I think that's what I put a lot into practice today. But at the time I thought, okay, how can I materialize this? Because I wasn't really aware how I could do that in the wine trade. And I went to journalism. I studied a master's in journalism in Madrid. I learned Spanish. It's quite helpful nowadays because some of the rising markets like Mexico and, mainly Mexico, Spanish is a useful language. But apart from that, it just makes me understand a few more people in the world. Not necessarily, I don't know how much I put it into practice in the wine trade, but journalism explores those communication techniques even further. And that was obviously a really interesting experience. Then I realized I wasn't curious enough about enough things to become a brilliant journalist, but I'm curious enough about wine. So eventually I gave up that part of investigation or communication and came back into the wine trade. And the first job I got was at Bacalhoa as a PR to actually establish their PR area. Well, they didn't have a PR department or anything, and I came in as the PR person, a lot with media relations. And I was 24 at the time, and it was an incredible experience because it was my first experience away from the Douro and away from port, because for me as a wine consumer, I've always been a port wine consumer, and then I became a wine consumer. So it was the inverse logic of what I think most people go through. So I discovered wine in this company, and I explored all the different regions where they're based, and that was incredible because even though I'm Portuguese, and even though we lived here and you lived here and we spent a lot of our holidays here, I didn't really know Portugal. And so I think that was the first time I had the chance to travel around the country, understand all the different regions, all the different cultures, all the different gastronomical influences in each, or specificities in each region, the nature, everything. And it gave me an incredible outlook on our country, which is so diverse and so spectacular. And that was a great experience. And then I started working with my father at Quinta Val Dona Maria, so back into the Douro in 2013. And that was obviously an incredible experience, but in a small company, family company, you have the family company, not necessarily small, but we have to be very hands-on and very available for many different circumstances. And that, I think, gave me an incredible capacity to respond to this. I think it's quite a demanding industry. You have to be available, you have to be receptive to a lot of people in different circumstances and travel and everything. That was incredible. I got to see the world without it being through books for the first time. And eventually, so I think everything starts making part of this large cooking pot, which is eventually me becoming more knowledgeable about wine, and therefore I studied a postgraduate course at Católica in viticulture and winemaking to really then understand the technical side of a world that I was already naturally interested in. And
which is very key from a communications point of view. You've obviously then traveled, you understand the different wine growing regions in Portugal, understanding what makes the Douro special, but then also having the technical knowledge is key if you're communicating and storytelling like you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think there's no point in trying to explain. Also, in another perspective, the first year that I was working at Quinta Val d'Ana Maria and back in the Douro, one of the things we most mention about the Douro and about port is how difficult most conditions are, you know, how extreme the conditions are in the Douro. And really, I didn't really know them. You know, I'd experienced them at specific seasons of the year, maybe at Christmas time and at summertime, but I had never actually been in the vineyard and worked in the vineyard. So I made sure I had that experience for 2 years, and I was living in the Douro, working as much as I could in the vineyard and in those conditions, because it really does help to explain a lot of what we do. And also have that broader vision of how you do it in other regions in Portugal or around the world really, really makes the Douro stand out. And that's very
so speaking about different wine growing regions, in 2016, you were one of the founding members of Duva, Portugal Wine Girls. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came together and what the objectives are?
We started a little earlier. We started in 2012, and what brought us together was an article written by a Portuguese journalist called Fernando Melo, who wanted to talk about the new generations in family-owned wineries. And as you know, in the wine trade, it's quite relevant. Otherwise, we wouldn't always be talking about it, because the idea of continuity is super, super important, not just in people, but the product itself, and in this what we now call sustainable growth, but continuity has always been really relevant. And so it's relevant to keep talking about who are the new faces, what's coming up, who's going to guarantee that this keeps being done in ways that has been pre-established. And so we were women, most of us were women who were going to step up or who were starting to appear within these family structures in the wine trade. And so he thought that was really interesting, and he got that angle, and he said, well, the future of these wine companies is women. And so when we started talking, we found a lot of different points in common, a lot to do with the pressure of continuity, because I think we celebrate a lot of startups and a lot of new ideas, and the world has focused a lot on that. But the pressure of continuity, of really making these ideas worthwhile, is how long they last in time and how strong they are in innovating themselves and continuing to exist. So I think the responsibility of the new generations is very, very important. So when some people call me empreendedora, I don't know how you say this in English, whatever. Yeah, empreendedora is this is so annoying because it has an English word. But but I don't think I'm empreendedora, so I am not a startup in the least. I am completely aware of what has been done before me. I'm trying to give continuity to it and a new face, and just find a place in it for this idea, which may be port, which may be red wine, the new still wines of the Douro, which may be whatever has been created before me by my father or by my grandfather or whoever else in a changing world. And entrepreneur, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So we came together not as a group of entrepreneurs, but finding these common grounds as the idea of continuity, new family members, and also obviously maybe an underlying message of what it is to feel like a woman in this industry. But I don't think we felt necessarily different. But what we came to discover is that other people thought it was relevant to talk about this. So it was important for us to show a unity under that umbrella, that we are women in positions that may be positions of power. And one thing that I did study in history is that it's very, very hard to understand the position of women throughout history because they didn't have positions of power or they were not literate to write about other women. And I think that kind of stuck to me in kind of my subconscious. And so for me, it's really important, or became important, to show myself in my industry as a woman, so that you start getting references. And it's a more, when you look at the world and when you look back at the wine trade or history, you see that it's a wider range of people, whether they're women, men, Portuguese, English, Dutch. I think port, even though it might have been very male focused, has always had a factor of diversity, which is super interesting and super important. We've always had different nationalities involved in the trade, which has created different confluences of ideas. We've always exported. That's always been, in the port trade, we've always looked outside our own country, and so have always made the product to meet the standards of really diverse consumers. And I think being a woman and showing my position in the trade is just adding to this idea.
And what do you think? Why did you feel the need to create a women-only group, and what do you feel like still needs to change, perhaps, in the wine industry in terms of women's roles?
So this was an organic creation. We were the new face. We were women. We were young. The new generation was very female. So we're going to grab that. That's an opportunity that has been given. We're going to take it. So we create this association to promote Portuguese wines through an interface which is female. We weren't going to discuss female issues or women's rights or any of it. It was just that's what happened to be the reality. So we were women, but then we became forced to discuss our identity, because that became the discussion, which in a way for me is very interesting, because as you know, Quinta Val Dona Maria belongs to a group called the Douro Boys, which have all been men, and they've never been asked that question.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that says a lot about us as women having started the group, or if it says a lot about the world that is so interested in discussing this difference or discussing this fact. And so for me, I like this conversation, but I also get a little bit annoyed by it, because I've never seen my father have to answer, so 5 men in the wine trade, so what's up with that?
Of course, and it's a mindset shift, isn't it? I mean, the objective, as you've put on various communications around the group, is to basically elevate the perception of Portuguese wine. Your female producers from different wine growing regions in Portugal, the objective is to elevate the perception of Portuguese wine. That's it.
And try to create an image of Portuguese wine. It's not a women's movement, but it becomes it naturally. But we are not forcing it. So I guess I have to go back to my women's studies to be able to answer a few questions a bit better. Because in terms of going back to your question, what has changed in the trade for women? Things have started changing a while ago. The first woman winemaker in Portugal, I think I can say the first official woman winemaker to actually be the face of a wine company is Filipa Tomás da Costa from Bacalhau, and she graduated in 83 or 84. I don't want to be wrong about that date. So it was more or less around that time that there was an official graduate course at universities here in Portugal. And that obviously brings about a huge change. Mm-hmm. And so women were no longer just in the industry, in the back office. They start being the faces of the companies. I think that's the biggest change. Mm-hmm. The second change is how much women are paid in the countryside. And as you know, many local people, starting with the men that work in the vineyard, don't see it with brilliant eyes that women receive exactly the same payment sometimes mm-hmm. for the same job. Mm-hmm. And that has to change at a global level. And more so in the field. And many companies have that consciousness, like Symington, like ourselves, like the Douro Boys. We're conscious about equal pay for equal job, mm-hmm. but you do still hear in the region
the differences.
Yeah, and I think that really, if anything, in terms of gender focus, that should be part of our responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so what sort of initiatives do you do then as a group? Being from different regions in Portugal, what sort of initiatives and activities do you do?
Well, we started by doing tastings here in Portugal, and in a way, one of the things that is most complicated about associations is finding time to come together and getting things organized. So unfortunately, we were rethinking the whole structure literally a year ago. May last year, we were closing up on plans, and then COVID happened. So a lot of this is on standby, unfortunately, because we were just organizing tastings, and whenever there was, I'm not sure if this is my internet or your internet, something stopped. Sorry, I don't know if your internet stopped or mine.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear it. And so what we were doing was just, if there was any journalist interested in doing a piece about Portugal, we had everything organized. So we could talk about most of the regions and get the information out. And we were starting to export an idea. And mm-hmm. then, well, we've been stopped for about 2 years whilst we were reorganizing, resetting. Right. Because to be honest, one of the things that was relevant is we have to stop just being asked questions because we're women, because mm-hmm. we have really important roles within our companies. We have Catarina from Irlanda Roussin, who mm-hmm. has an incredible investment on water reduction in all across the board, and she's a specialist in that. Obviously, Luisa Amorim and everything she sets up, Mafalda Gage, and how they managed to build brands. Mm-hmm. Talking about the Douro, Maria Manuel from Poças, and her work in viticulture, and how that is still rare, a position like mm-hmm. herself in culture, and her amazing job there. So we were being targeted because we were women and not because of what we know. Mm-hmm. And so we called a halt. We said, that's enough. This conversation will
change the narrative.
Yeah. So we need to change the narrative. What can we offer, and how can we show mm-hmm. our faces with more content? Because we do have much more to say.
Much more to give, and a focus should not just be on female producers. It should be on your ideas, your initiatives, and not just the fact that it's women coming together.
Yes.
Because the producers themselves are really exciting, from really, really exciting regions within Portugal as well.
And we do have wines that speak for themselves. So,
so you mentioned lockdown. Mm-hmm. Provas in Casa. Mm-hmm. How did the idea come about, and what's the response been like?
The idea came about pretty naturally. I went into lockdown on the 12th of March. It was a Thursday. And I was at home with my husband, and I said, "What are we going to do? We're going to be locked in." And this has a backstory. I've been in charge of the brand Kita Valana Maria for the past 3 years since we went into Kita Valana Maria got bought by Avleda, and I literally, sorry, that was a phone call coming in. And I got a change of role I was about to start on the 2nd of March. I started the PR department in Avleda. On the 8th, I supplied the plan. I did it in a week for the year. And on the 12th, I went into lockdown. So I was like, okay, so I've just been given a department that has nothing to do. So what are we going to do? And what do people need? Because we're just hearing all these horrible stories, all the news, everything you're being bombarded with is negative, it's scary, it's isolating. So how can we get close to people, so prevent isolation, bring some good, and give back? Because I just felt like everything was being taken away. And so I know about wine, so I thought I'm gonna talk about wine, teach about wine, because that's all I can give back. Set up the Instagram account. The company was behind me in this, and my husband is an amazing artist and he can draw amazingly. So I was like, how can I make a live session, talk about wine, explain fermentation to people that probably don't know much about it, and make it interesting? And he started doing the drawings, and we did the drawings together. They worked out really well, so that kind of created a communication line for us. And I think it was the way that it became so approachable, and it really made the language about wine less complicated, and for anybody to understand. And so that's literally how it started. We started with 3 live sessions a week, which was extremely demanding and hardworking. We were dedicating about 4 to 5 hours per day just for that. And obviously when lockdown ended, I knew that I wouldn't have an agenda for that, nor would my husband. Hopefully he'd get back to work, which he has. And so we've reduced the amount of hours, but it's still going. We've had to reconsider. Well, I thought I was going to have to give it up, but I found a way of keeping it going. We have an incredible communication agency that helps us out, which is People Agency, and it's been good. I love the direct contact with people.
Well, I think going back to the illustrations and the drawings, I think that's a really, really unique way of communicating what is actually quite a challenging topic, which is wine. And also it can put people off. So I think that you've approached it in a really, really interesting way. And given that your background and what you do now, a huge part obviously is communication and storytelling. And I feel like Provas in Casa is a great sort of illustration of how we can communicate wine in a way that's actually going to resonate with people. So I'm a huge fan. I think it's wonderful. I mean, that goes on to my next question, which is, do you see it continuing? Obviously, lockdown is now over, but obviously there are still restrictions. Do you see a future for it? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think the live sessions are really interesting because it's when I pass on a lot of information, which you can't necessarily through our posts. And that's also where I dedicate my time to gaining more content. So I'll be doing that every 2 weeks. And during the week, we'll be doing motion graphics to try and explain to people. They actually write to me, which is great, saying they're too fast. You need to put the motion graphics slightly slower so that I can get all the information. Yeah, I'm like, okay. So we're trying to perfect the way we transmit information. So I think wine is an endless subject. It really just means how much you want to dig into it. And so I feel that if I start exploring just the grape varieties, we'll never leave Provas in Casa, and then we can go on to soils, and we can go on to climates. There's so much to explore. So we'll keep working.
Okay. Well, it looks like we are almost at the end of the session.
Yes.
Is there anything else you want to touch on? Anything that's on the horizon in terms of ideas and projects?
I'm not sure you're aware of this one, but you know, I've been in touch with your cousins, with Rob and Charlotte, because one of my I really like the project you've done with School of Port, with trying to educate people on port, and there's so many barriers when it comes to port because of the categories, and people don't understand what's a ruby, what's a tawny. Like, we hear all these different misconceptions. So how can we make this language more approachable? How can we get people to try the different wines? It's so important. So how can we transmit the same ideas differently? That's all it is, because we're not going to change the categories. We're not going to change the IVDP or history. And one of my dreams is to bring in an association that dedicates itself to talk about fortified wines, because I don't think port is the only drink that has that issue. You know, Jerez has that issue, Muscatel has that issue, Madeira has that issue. There's so many barriers that are keeping people from experimenting what for me is the most fabulous wine in the world, which is port. So I think that's on the horizon for sure.
And so with Provas in Casa, what are the sorts of questions that you get around port, if any? Is it focused more on wine in general, or do you get those types of questions?
And people, wine in general, in our case, and people are very interested in sustainability and organic and what's the difference. People are interested in talking. One of the things that really surprised me, which was great, when we talked about the regions, many people were interested in talking about the regions that we hadn't focused on, like Trás-os-Montes and Beiras, which you don't see as much in supermarkets or in wine stores. So I was surprised that people were even interested in learning about that, which means the consumers are curious. So there's always a window of opportunity for us. It's just we have to manage to talk to them and tell them, talk them into trying. There's nothing better in wine than tasting. That's why it's quite adventurous in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially
in this crazy adventure.
I was going to say, especially if you can generate and build on their interest in the way that you're doing, both through sort of illustrations, through tastings. That's really exciting to hear, and I agree. I think education is a key part. What we all should be doing as sort of the next generation attached to port wine producers, whatever it might be, because there is a perception that both port but also wine in general is a hard sort of category to sort of understand. And if you start breaking it down, actually there are some really wonderful stories. There are some really fascinating elements that can bring people in a way that's actually a little bit more accessible and doesn't feel quite so far removed from perhaps their everyday life, particularly within the port industry.
Definitely.
Great. Well, I think we should probably let people go and have their dinners.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Francisca, for joining, and thank you everyone for watching. If anyone has any questions for this session that you didn't get to ask, or if you have any suggestions for topics going forward, please send us any direct messages. And Francisca, mais uma vez, thank you very much.
Thank you. I like this hashtag, Port for the 21st Century.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you so much, Harry.
Okay, thank you.
Speak soon. Beijinhos, bye.